Welcome back to Brighter Morning with Bo. My name is Bo Tiwari, and we're glad you've stayed with us on U97.5 FM radio, Hot Like Pepper radio, Multicultural radio, and MCTV, Multicultural TV. We are here every morning, Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., and we discuss serious issues about the country and issues that concern you. Thank you for viewing, and thank you for listening, and thank you for being with us. Our guest on the line now is Dr. Marlene Attz, who is a development economist, and we've talked with her before, but we'll talk with her again today. She always has very clear perspectives, so we will talk with her. But what I want to say to you before we go on is that tomorrow, we just talked to the Minister of Agriculture, and we are going to talk to retired Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture tomorrow, Dr. Wayne Gunpat, Professor Wayne Gunpat. And we are also going to talk about Gabriel Faria, the Chief Executive Officer of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce. So you can be prepared to engage us on that particular matter. But we go on now to Dr. Attz. How are you?
I am good. I can't complain. I'm alive. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago, and good morning again to you for inviting me to have a chat this morning.
Well, thank you so much for coming. And I wonder if you listened to the Minister of Agriculture.
Yes, I caught some of what he was saying. I didn't catch from the start, but I heard some of what he was saying in terms of his position on greenhouses, the food import bill, the challenges that we've seen, the kinds of decisions, and the kinds of change in policy that I noted he said that he's changed his position on greenhouses, and there was a conversation around land. So I just caught snippets of it as I was logging on and doing the testing behind the scenes.
Okay.
And then I also heard the news, an interesting position taken by the police service representative. I heard that in terms of the number of police officers who have been impacted by COVID-19, and in fact, those who have lost their lives. So interesting conversations I caught just before I came on.
Yes. One of the problems is that, the loss of life through COVID or anything else is not a nice thing. And I'm sorry, really very sorry. I lost one very good friend who died from COVID, who was a police officer. And that young man, he was a very young guy in his 30s, should not have died in my estimation. But he died anyway, and it's a loss. And I want to really, really commiserate with the police service for that. But the other thing that I'm concerned about is that I don't understand how people in frontline services like the police will not go and get the vaccine.
Well, I'm glad you raised it, because it seems, as I listened to Mr. Dixon, I think is his name, and he said, not one life should have been lost, and I absolutely agree with him. The loss of life and the impact on these persons, their colleagues, their families, the psychological impact. But it seems counterintuitive to me that you are essential and you're in the front line, but based on reports, the Prime Minister, a couple of weeks ago in his COVID-19 update, spoke about the levels of vaccine hesitancy among some of our essential frontline workers. And the police were ranking fairly significantly in terms of vaccine hesitancy. So while we commiserate, and it is unfortunate, and the loss of any life to COVID-19 is regrettable, because we know that there are going to be psychological impacts for their friends, their families, etc. But it seems counterintuitive to me that while Mr. Dixon acknowledges that no life should be lost, there is not a parallel conversation that says we want to encourage our members. I've seen advertisements coming out of the Ministry of National Security with different arms. You have spokespersons saying that they've been vaccinated, but it really does seem a little counterintuitive to me that there is a vaccine hesitancy, but there is also a comment being made that not one police officer's life should have been lost. I totally agree with that conversation, but and that statement. But I would have liked to see some kind of simultaneous urgency encouraging members.
As sympathetic as I am, and as much as I commiserate, and as much as I extend condolences, and as I said, I had a personal loss in the police service for this, I want to say that I am highly intolerant of the police service not taking a more proactive view
approach
of getting their people who are frontline workers and who are exposing the public.
Well, they're exposing the public, but it's two-way causality. They're also exposed. I mean, when you walk into a police station to file a report, or if you are a victim, or if you are a perpetrator of a crime and the police have to engage with you,
and
they are exposing you, and you're also exposing them. So that's what I said. It seems counterintuitive to me that there is not a more aggressive sort of campaign, certainly on the part of persons like Mr. Dixon, to encourage his colleagues, his friends, his co-workers to be vaccinated. So it is a kind of catch-22, and it is related to the upcoming budget and the trajectory for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of what happens to us as we try to navigate a way forward, notwithstanding the COVID-19 realities. But vaccine hesitancy, I have to say my position is that vaccine hesitancy is not consistent with getting our economy back on track.
That is true. That is true. So, we had one there.
So let me just put that out there.
No. It's a big issue, and I'm glad we are starting to discuss that. Starting by discussing that, which is that we want the economy to get to the point of revival, right? Recovery is a long way off, but at least revival is possible.
Sure.
If you want it to revive, then businesses have to open.
Correct.
It means the public service has to open. It means all the institutions that serve the society have to begin to open. Now, if you are going to do that, you want a certain amount of safety and security for the people who are going to come to work, whether
Correct.
It's in the public sector or in the private sector. And you cannot have a situation in which people are taking the position that it is my freedom, it is my right not to get the vaccine. But they want to tell their employer how to deal with this. They want to tell the other workers who are vaccinated that they have no rights. It's my right that counts.
It is.
I find this thing irrational.
I often quote your beloved deceased comrade, Lloyd Best. Lloyd had coined the term unresponsible, which I love. I mean, there's several things that I liked about Lloyd in terms of his quotable moments.
Yes.
And unresponsible means that we're not willing to take responsibility for anything. We want to blame somebody else for it. So in the COVID-19 situation and what is happening in the economy, while the two things are related, it is very easy for us to blame the government, because the government has a responsibility for macroeconomic management. And somehow we also think the government is responsible for reopening the economy, while we take no responsibility for our vaccine hesitancy or for not encouraging other persons to get vaccinated. So the conversation has, over the last year or so, has moved from different layers of blame. So there was, first of all, there were no vaccines. Then there were some vaccines, and there was not the right combination of vaccines. Now we have all kinds of vaccines. But we, the people, are not taking responsibility to avail ourselves of the vaccines that are on the market, that are locally available. So we kind of wax and wane between who we blame for what at different points in time. And I really think that until and unless we, the people, realize that the reopening of the economy in whatever shape or form, I mean, you've called the public service, the private sector. I'm talking about roadside vendors, I'm talking about itinerant vendors, I'm talking about all of those things that we like to do. You want to go around the savannah, you want to do this, you want to do X, Y, and Z. All of the things that you feel you have been denied over the last couple of months all hinge on a healthy society, because I don't think any one of us wants to contemplate a situation where we have to revert to the kind of lockdown that we experienced in March or April of 2020. I don't think anyone wants to contemplate that. And while the literature talks about herd immunity, and I'm not a medical doctor, but I think everyone understands that the reopening of the economy, so those of us who looked online in shock and horror, well, I looked online in shock and horror, where you had Labor Day parties last week in New York. Many Trinbagonians went and participated in those parties. Very few masks were seen. You saw crowds of 7,000 people, and people are comparing what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago and the fact that we're still in lockdown with what they saw on social media taking place in the United States of America. One, we're not too sure if all of those persons, they were actually vaccinated. I don't know what systems were put in place. But two, the United States was further advanced and is further advanced, and countries like the United Kingdom, which we like to compare ourselves to, further advanced in terms of achieving herd immunity. We in Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but I don't know that we've reached 20% having persons in Trinidad and Tobago who are fully vaccinated. I don't know that we've got there, but as I said, I've not looked at the numbers within recent times. But, you know, we have people who received first doses, some people who are saying they're not going for the second dose. You have persons who have influence talking about, you know, don't allow anybody to force you into taking a vaccine. And it's not about being forced. And I understand that some persons, because of their health circumstances, may be hesitant, etc., etc. But there are ways around it. Seek counsel from a medical practitioner and do what is in your best interest. But certainly at the national level, if we want to have a conversation about recovery or restarting or reigniting the economy, that conversation has to be linked to some level of significant immunity against COVID-19. Otherwise, we will find ourselves regressing to where we were last year and having all of these lockdown measures. I mean, we have Delta, we have Mu, we have all sorts of variants. I mean, there is no shortage of information in terms of threats that we're facing from COVID-19. So I just want to use this opportunity, not to pontificate, but to say that really and truly Trinbagonians, if we want to get ahead in any shape or form, it really is dependent on all aspects. All citizens, whether you consider yourself essential, non-essential, as the case might be, frontline, backline, whatever, getting the vaccine so that we have a better chance of surviving this.
Go and get vaccinated. You are complaining about the education system, and we admit there are lots of things wrong with the education system. There are lots of things wrong with the SEA, lots of things wrong with CXC. Half of our children do not get 5 passes. We understand that. But you cannot not vaccinate your children, and therefore they won't be able to go to school, and you complaining about the education system. It is your child.
It is a collective, it is a call for collective responsibility, which is why I think Lloyd's notion of unresponsible is important. It is collective responsibility. So the government had a responsibility to make vaccines available to the population. The government has fulfilled that responsibility in part. People could complain about the length of time it took, it didn't take. The fact of the matter is that we have at least, 4 or 5 types of vaccines available in Trinidad and Tobago now. So there is no shortage. I mean, I heard over the weekend community-based initiatives, come with your birth paper, it don't matter, come with your birth paper, we brought it. So there is no shortage of opportunities. So it is now left to us, the citizens, to do the responsible things for ourselves, for our families, and for our children. I mean, the media has stories about families being decimated because you lost two parents, you lost two siblings, you lost two family members in very quick succession. I mean, we have no shortage of these examples. So I think there really is I really want to call on my fellow Trinbagonians to do right by ourselves. This is not for anybody else, but it's for you, so that you have a fighting chance to essentially navigate some circumstances and allow the economy to reopen and for us to get back to some kind of steady state. It is not going to be a pretty picture. There are some challenging times ahead for us, but certainly to allow the economy to reopen so that we can kind of collectively put our heads together and get back on track.
All right. Let's shift a little bit now, Dr. Attz, and I'll just ask you two quick questions on the Minister of Agriculture's engagement with me this morning. One of the things, are you, from all the things that he said, one, do you think that we can do more to deal with this question of producing more of the food that we need to consume and therefore reducing the import bill? So that's the first thing. And secondly, do you really think that the state should get involved in more investment in agriculture rather than let the private sector proceed with this, even if there is a guiding hand by government in terms of making the government-to-government arrangements for technology, etc.? So answer them in sequence for me, please.
All right. In the first part, I think the conversation around agriculture is welcome. It is overdue, but it is also indicative of what I think many persons are familiar with the term Dutch disease. It is indicative of what is happening in our economic space. Because we have been so heavily dependent on oil and gas and the energy sector, we have and we had the money back in the golden days to import everything that we wanted to consume. So Trinidad and Tobago is characterized by an economic system that produces what it does not consume, because we export our oil and gas, and we consume things that we do not produce. So that is the quandary that we find ourselves in. But I think there is an opportunity now. There is nothing like a crisis to focus your mind. And there is a crisis in the energy sector. The Minister of Finance in his mid-year review alluded to, well, not even alluded, he essentially indicated that government revenues had fallen significantly below what was anticipated because of declines in the energy sector. Production in natural gas and the downstream sectors, lower production than anticipated, resulted in lower revenues accruing to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And our economic growth prospects, based on what is happening in the energy sector, remain extremely weak and are likely to be subdued, certainly for the medium term. So now is the time for us to pivot. I've always spoken about the need for us to have a structural adjustment and an industrial policy linked to that structural adjustment. I think now is the opportunity for us to capitalize on that. And agriculture is one way for us to have the conversation. What I would suggest, however, and I heard in your promo that Professor Ganpat is going to be on tomorrow, so he can speak more eloquently to some of the issues. But I think certainly the conversation around agriculture needs to transition away from traditional agriculture, where we keep talking about land. Land is important, and land tenure to provide security for our farmers. That is absolutely important. But it is equally important, I think, for us to look towards the technological dimensions of agriculture.
Yes,
essentially shift the pendulum a little bit. We're not discarding traditional agriculture. There will always be a role and a function for that. But to swing the pendulum towards the agriculture, the technological dimensions of agriculture, one, so that it is more attractive to youth, because we hear the age-old criticisms about agriculture. Nobody are going out there 6 o'clock in the morning to take and the hot sun. And technology abounds. The Faculty of Food and Agriculture at UWI, and I'm not making a plug, but as you know from your former life, is the only Faculty of Food and Agriculture throughout the University of the West Indies that that expands throughout several countries. We have invested a lot, and Professor Ganpat is, as I said, in a better position to talk about that than I am. But I certainly know that the Faculty of Food and Agriculture has invested in technology, and it is training its students to go out there and to use technology, hydroponics, vertical systems, etc., etc., etc. So there is an opportunity for us to change the narrative around agriculture in the national landscape and to move towards that. So if we change that narrative, and if we swing the pendulum, or we move the pendulum in a different direction, I think there is an opportunity for us not to completely eliminate the import food bill, but certainly to bring greater local content to the table. And I noted recently, and it's just to allow me to segue into your second part of your second question about government versus private sector involvement in the agriculture sector. I was reading recently, and I'm sure you'd have seen it, the conversation around Berry Cove, a company that is going to invest in providing berries. I presume they would have done all of their research, done their financials, their business plans, that would have led to a conclusion that this was a worthwhile investment. Now, having said that, I think that there is a continued role for the government, because the agriculture sector has not essentially gained sufficient traction in the national landscape. I think there is need for government to have an overarching agriculture policy that puts the sector center stage and essentially outlines the strategy for developing a more robust agriculture sector. So there is a role for government in that regard. Now, I recognize, however, and included in that strategy that government is meant to lay out will be, of course, how it will unclog the arteries and remove all of those bottlenecks that stymie business development in Trinidad and Tobago. So we all know the challenges that are articulated and that are documented in the ease of doing business reports. The inefficiency, the length of time it takes to get approvals, but also specific to the agriculture sector is the whole question of pre-deal larceny. So there is a role for the government to essentially carve out a space as part of a structural adjustment strategy and an industrial policy strategy, and the two are, I think, linked to how it is going to essentially see this sector evolve and what are the strategies it will put in place to help unclog the arteries and to remove those bottlenecks. Now, we recognize that government doesn't have the financial wherewithal. We are constrained because of what has been happening to government's revenues, significant amount of borrowing, etc. But the minister did speak about a growing relationship with the government of China, these bilateral conversations. And I think there are opportunities for the government, as I said, to lay the foundation to essentially articulate a very clear strategy for sustainable agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago. I think one of the things that has been a challenge in Trinidad and Tobago is that every time we talk about agriculture, it is in context of a crisis. And once the crisis passes, or we think the crisis passes,
yeah, we're going back to the same.
We go back to the same old. And I think the crisis that is in front of us, the two main crises. I mean, there's several others. The weak economic growth prospects based on subdued energy prices, that is one crisis, but also COVID-19. COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon. It is going to probably subside. Hopefully, there will be no new variants found anytime soon, because that, of course, always poses a threat. And then, of course, there are other threats like climate change, all of those other things. When I did my research on climate change, it was thought of as a slow onset disaster. But some of the things we're seeing now in terms of the variations and even what is happening in one part of Trinidad and Tobago as opposed to another. So in the west, you could be having torrential showers and heavy flood again. In the east, it's as dry as chip. So I mean, all of these things are threats that we're facing. But I think, notwithstanding those, we're at that juncture in our national space where there is an opportunity for us to craft a strategy driven by government for sustainable agriculture, but onboarding private sector partners. You will not get private sector partners coming into this business to provide the kind of support that is required if they're going to encounter bottlenecks and stopgaps and inefficiencies that are going to thwart their efforts. So I am saying that there is a role for public-private partnership But government certainly has to lay the foundation in a very real strategic way to provide that support for private sector partners to come in.
All right. So I think there's a general agreement that, I mean, we've reached a tipping point in terms of agricultural strategy and the policies required to make that strategy work for us for self-sustainability as part of your economic strategy. I think there's there might be arguments about how or whatever, but I think we are agreed on that.
The fine tuning, yes. Mm-hmm.
Huh?
There might be some differential, some different opinion.
But we are agreed on that. We've got to produce more food. We've got to make ourselves more self-sufficient, and we've got to leverage agriculture as a potential economic opportunity in the world system. Okay?
Yes.
But I think I want to ask you this. The government went into retreat recently. The budget date has now been announced, October 4th. And when they went into retreat, they were basically apprising themselves of what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what might be some of the choices that they have. From your point of view, reflecting on this, with your knowledge of the economic situation in Trinidad and Tobago, your knowledge of the economic history, and your assessment of the critical choices that we must make, what do you think that the cabinet should have been most focused on in Tobago, and how should that translate into budget priorities for October 4th?
Well, I always like to quote.
Well, I know I asked you an easy question there, right?
I always like to quote a former Minister of Finance who, when he engaged a group of us one Saturday morning for new ideas, and I presented, I forget what it was because it's many, many decades ago. He said to me, he said, Dr. Attz, I like the way you think, he said, good economics, but bad politics. And that has always stuck with me. That sometimes the way economists see things and the lens through which we look at what is happening around us doesn't often align with how politicians see things. But that said, let me begin by answering the question with laying some context. I started chatting about what is happening in terms of our fiscal space. We're going to have a larger fiscal deficit because of simply be driven by the COVID-19 restrictions, and also the need for the government to dig deeper to fund the Ministry of Health and some of the attendant issues that arose because of COVID-19 restrictions. So there was the additional spend to the health sector. There were the grants, the salary relief grants, and the other provisions that were provided through social development. And government has essentially had to borrow its way out of this deficit situation that we find ourselves in. So the fiscal deficit is going to be significantly higher than had been budgeted when the budget was read at the end of last fiscal year. And government has also gone to the external market. Government has drawn down on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Government got $644 million from the IMF in terms of special drawing rights, which is going to be added to our reserves. So I don't even want to call it a real hope there, but some kind of fillip to the economy was provided because of those SDRs. But one of the other things, apart from that fiscal outlook, is that there has been increase in unemployment. The latest official statistics from the CSO talk about 5.1%, but we know that is really what is literally officially, because unemployment defined in economics really is people who are looking. Somebody's unemployed if they're actually looking for a job. So that is probably what that 5.1% is. But I think we know the reality is going to be more significant than that, because there are persons who may not fall within that net by the CSO. So I'm saying all of that to establish a context for what is facing the Minister of Finance and what is facing the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and what is essentially going to provide context for the narrative that the Minister of Finance is going to come to share. What I think should be the focus is really people-centered, what I call people-centered recovery and a people-centered plan. And by that, I want to be very clear. I do not mean more salary relief grants. I mean, how do we... So two things. One, I don't mean more salary relief grants, and I also don't mean a focus on the allocations to the respective ministries. For some time now, for some years now, I found myself in a space where I'm less concerned with the allocations to the ministries, so whether it's education getting the greater share or national security, but what do those allocations mean for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, for the well-being of the people of Trinidad and Tobago? So what I would want to see is a focus on people-centered recovery, conversations around a couple of things. How do we talk about the allocations, because that is always going to be a feature of the budget presentations. How do we talk about those allocations in terms of what they mean for people? So if we talk about the allocation to the education system, what does it mean for trying to close some of those gaps that we saw emerging between the last fiscal year and the present fiscal year? How do we get back on track some of those youth who have in fact fallen through the education cracks because of gaps that existed in the education system, or as a result of inequalities that have surfaced? We have now been living with COVID-19 reality for a year and a half, thereabouts. And I think the budget for fiscal 2022 provides us with an opportunity to establish a new normal, not to sound cliched, but how do we get ourselves back to some steady state, notwithstanding what COVID-19 has done for us? So people-centered recovery. The allocation to the Ministry of Education, I imagine, is going to be significant, but what do we do with that allocation to essentially close those gaps and to put our youth back on a different footing? I think in the conversation with the Minister of Agriculture, he spoke about the youth camps. The Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, I think it's called, is again going to take on, I think, a significant role. So an allocation there would be interesting to see, because let us not fool ourselves, and this is where the data are going to be important. And I am hoping that we really are capturing the data on what has been happening from a social side, social and economic side, in terms of what has been going on in Trinidad and Tobago for the last several months. What has been happening to our youth? I had the opportunity to have a conversation in a seminar with some members of the executive of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, and they shared some data on the increase in the number of youth under the age of 18 who are involved in serious crimes. And it seems to me that those data suggest that there is a link between these children, these youth not going to school, and they're getting involved in serious crimes. So there needs to be a conversation around those kinds of issues. There needs to be a conversation around migrants. And I know come October the 4th, the Minister of Finance cannot be all things to all persons, so he's simply going to provide the headlines. But I'm hopeful in the conversations that ensue from the various ministers thereafter, they pay attention to some of these issues. We have 60, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. We need to have a conversation around a migration policy. What has been happening? I know that we've extended the vaccines to the migrants, and certainly again from the newspaper reports, many of them took advantage of the opportunity to be vaccinated. But there needs to be a conversation. There needs to be a conversation around digital transformation, which I know is probably going to feature significantly because the government has been speaking about that. But how is that conversation going to, what is going to be the narrative around that? Digital transformation, we saw some of it emerging During the lockdown, many businesses decided to take advantage of digital platforms, food services, etc. A lot more advertising being done through digital platforms, a lot more of service provision through digital platforms. Even in the financial sector, the banks have now essentially transitioned some of their card systems, for example, so that you can use them for local online purchases. All of these things were commendable. But I always say that that digital transformation has to be predicated on an education platform. And by digital transformation and education, I don't simply mean persons having access to devices. Learning online, as you know in your former life, learning online is a whole different set of nuances. It requires a different approach, etc. So I'm hoping that in the conversation around education, digital transformation, youth, etc., I would also love to see if I were to be asked for one thing, back in 2012, and you would be very familiar with this, there was something called a Human Development Atlas that was done for Trinidad and Tobago. And while I did not agree with some of the content of that atlas in terms of whether it gave an accurate reflection of what was actually happening in Trinidad and Tobago, I think if we had to make an investment now to understand where Trinidad and Tobago is in terms of all of the social issues that we're facing, in terms of all of the economic circumstances, in terms of the inequalities that have surfaced, that we have become very much more attuned to over the last several months, something like the Atlas, if done properly, would provide a perfect platform for us to understand various points of intersection throughout Trinidad and Tobago and therefore make appropriate interventions. And why I think that is important is because we do not have the financial wherewithal that we did in the past to do all of the things that we want to do. So I am saying that any investment that is made at this point in time has to yield significant outcomes for us, because we do not have the money to address all of the youth issues that we have. We do not have the money to address all of the crime issues that we have. We do not have the money to address all of the education issues that we have. We do not have the money to address all of the unemployment issues that we have. We do not have it is a challenge. So whatever is the spend across the various ministries has to yield multiple dividends. We have to address youth in our school. We have to close those education gaps. We have to close those inequality gaps, because if we don't, not only will it impact on us in the short term, but our medium to long term trajectory in terms of the achievement of things like the Sustainable Development Goals to which we are committed will be severely compromised.
You have a situation where there are inequalities in the society. That's a fact. That's a reality. But you also have a problem of money scarcity for the state. You therefore cannot address that inequality issue purely by handouts or transfer of money.
Precisely.
So you've got to find a formula that will give people the wherewithal for self-sustainability, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, in our pattern, in our expenditure for last year and the year before, you have, I don't have the map here to say the percentages, but what I do remember for a fact is that you have a very small percentage for development expenditure. Last year, I think it was 3%. In other words, the PSIP was severely underfunded, and secondly, under-executed. All right? There is also limited money that the state has to spend in any case on operations, recurrent expenditure, as well as development expenditure. So you need strong policies that will create the kind of confidence required to give people the wherewithal to intervene. How do we do that?
Well, I think we have to first appreciate where we are, and we also have to appreciate that providing handouts, the salary relief grants, I understand, were necessary because COVID-19 took many people by surprise, and the closures that ensued took many people by surprise. But I'm saying that in moving forward and recognizing that revenues, there is a revenue constraint and therefore an expenditure constraint. Whatever is spent has to be strategic, and let's talk about a couple of things. We need to have data to help us understand what is happening on the national landscape. And I'm not saying data that is politically correct or data that does not paint a true picture, but things like what economists call the Gini coefficient. What are the levels of inequalities? And to my mind, if one were to do either, now is a good time to either do the atlas to which I referred, the Human Development Atlas. And I think the atlas would be a good idea because it allows you for layers of situations, so you can see what the poverty levels are like, hopefully an accurate picture of the poverty levels, what they're like. You can see layers of what educational access is like, people who are actually enrolled, because we know that education is widely accessible. But persons who are actually enrolled, and whether they're early childhood, whether they're primary, secondary, tertiary, etc., because it gives you a sense of what the development trajectory is going to be like. It would give you, if you had a layer of what the unemployment figures look like. And I think in the absence of those kinds of data, government strategy could well be a hit and miss. And I'm saying that at a time where you are experiencing significant revenue shortfalls, notwithstanding the fact that we've kind of looked to borrowing to kind of fill that gap, where you have these shortfalls, it is incumbent on the government to have appropriate data to guide its strategy and to guide its interventions. Now, in terms of persons who become unemployed and trying to get people back, we need to, as part of an industrial policy, which is something I mentioned earlier on in our conversation, we need to identify what are going to be those strategic sectors that we're looking at moving forward. Energy will always play a role, but we have to admit that energy's role in the Trinidad and Tobago economy is not as robust as it used to be. So therefore, what are the new sectors that we're going to talk about? So we talked about digital transformation, but is the society ready for that digital transformation? Do we need to have significant amounts of retooling, reskilling, retraining? We've talked about things like small and medium enterprises, and I always like to work back from the small to talk about the nano and the micro enterprises. Those persons who have become unemployed as a result of COVID-19, they might have been retrenched, they might have been given severance payments, whatever the case might be, and they may want to start a business. They will not require the same amount of support as the medium enterprises. They probably require more support. Simple things like opening a bank account, which I understand is now a pain point for someone who wants to go into business. All of these things need to be done. So I'm saying that while there is no quick and dirty response, and while the government is going to be challenged, and I want to make that position abundantly clear, I think many of us understand that the government is going to be challenged, to spend our way out of this crisis. And when I say spend, whatever resources the government has, it has to invest in getting us out of this crisis. But it has to be a strategic intervention. And for that to be a strategic intervention, I think we need to work backwards and figure out what are the sectors we want to focus on. We talk about digital transformation. What is going to be the shape and form of that digital transformation? And do we have the requisite supporting institutional mechanisms to take us to that digital transformation? So talking about digital transformation alone as a panacea for Trinidad and Tobago is not sufficient. We have to understand what is required and how do we need to build out the population to support that transformation.
Well, I think it's, in a way, Dr. Attz, it's deeper than that too. It's not just the digital transformation. The question is, what is the digital transformation for? You want the digital transformation in order to have a smart economy, and you also want the digital transformation to have, so that you can have a smart, responsive public service. So that focus must determine what your digital transformation strategy is.
So you have to have an
to work
industrial.
backwards.
That's the point I made, that you have to work backwards. So you need to have an industrial policy that says, this is where I want us to go, and a structural adjustment policy linked to that industrial policy that says, this is where, given our circumstances in the energy sector, this is where I think we need to go, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, whatever the case might be, whether it is a more robust SME sector. And I'm saying SME loosely, but I also mean the nano and the micro. So the industrial policy says that there's going to be a deliberate strategic effort by the state to encourage activity in these particular sectors and to encourage economic transformation. And the digital transformation process is going to be part and parcel of that. But we need to first have some line of sight and then work backwards. And included in that is the role that the education and the education system, the education sector, and the output from that sector, the role that is going to play. So it's really a continuum. So rather than looking at one aspect of it, whether it's digital transformation or economic growth, it is really a continuum. And I also want to make the point that at the end of it all, whatever the government spends, economics is really about people. So at the end of all of this, we really want to see a better Trinidad and Tobago society. And when I say better, in terms of the well-being for each and every citizen as far as possible. So there are a number of things going inside of there, but certainly at a time where there is reduced expenditure, we need to ensure that we get sufficient bang for our buck.
We've got to close, Dr. Attz. I want to thank you very much for your contribution this morning.
You're most welcome.
Very lucid, very clear, very comprehensive. And remember, we have a date on October the 5th.
Yes, I remember we have a date on very early on October the 5th.
Yes, okay. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much for watching Brighter Morning with Bo. I am Bo Tiwari signing off this morning and passing on to Chanel Al-Suran for the news.